Okay, here I have the lettering that I'm going to use for this that I just printed out, and this is the stencil that I've cut out of acetate over the top of it that I've already sprayed with a little bit of spray mount. What I'm doing here is just, I actually have already sprayed it. I just want you to have a visual that something needs to be sprayed on it before it's sticky, to make it sticky. Here I was just drying it off. It needs to be dried off so that the pieces of adhesive don't stick to the board, so they need to be dried. I'm starting with the blue. Since this is chrome, it's going to be reflecting of what it's around, and typically it's sky, and the bottom will be a warmer color. I'm drying it in between here. If I put it down a little bit too wet, it will leak under the stencils a lot more easily. Here I'm giving somewhat of a horizon line, but it looks like I changed my mind. I wanted it to be white right next to the horizon line. I decided that it would be easier to do that first before I put the brown down representing the horizon. Now, part of what I want to acknowledge is I just did this on a large piece of paper, but at this point I really want you students to start working with Bristol board because of its increased thickness. You'll have much better luck with your stencils not leaking. With such thin paper, it's just wrinkling when it gets wet. But I want you to see the challenges as we go along. If you look really close, you could see the stencils lifting up a little bit. That's not a huge problem as long as you're working very dry. What that means is the paint's pretty dry when it hits. If you're putting it down so that it's still wet when it hits the board, your chances of it leaking are really high. I'm angling it down there because I want the overspray to go down rather than up. Here I decided that I just wanted a little bit more saturation of brighter color on the bottom. Here I'm using a shield to be able to go back over and lighten above the horizon line. I wanted a little bit more of a hard edge, and because white is so opaque, the overspray really is not something that I like. Overspray from color often tones surrounding areas, and it can make it more natural. But the white really has a tendency to cover everything too much. In this application, anyway. Now, the same thing can be accomplished with Frisket, but it's an awful lot easier if you use acetate. Again, the big advantage between acetate and other films is that acetate, you can score it part way, and then it will crack when you bend it. And with other films like Duralar, you have to cut all the way through. If you're cutting on the board, then that will cut your board, obviously. Another reason why I prefer acetate, if you can find it. Here I'm just replacing the letters, parts of the stencil. I'll show you why it's so important to get them lined up. Again, you can do this with Frisket, but it's a bit more challenging. You can see there how I'm cracking and taking the center out of the O. I really didn't worry about that before in masking that out, because I knew when I painted black on top it would just cover what was there anyway in the holes in the letters. Particularly when you need something to be really dark, the tendency is to put too much paint down, and that's just asking for your stencils to leak. So I'm trying to be careful to make sure it goes down pretty dry when it hits. I like to move around just to give the extra overspray of just plain air to give it a chance to dry. Here I'm checking to make sure the stencils are staying down. Obviously they're not. I know it's going to be a bit of an issue. Again, from here, the bond or the Bristol paper is going to serve you much, much better. The more paint I'm putting down, the more it's causing the paper to wrinkle. Again, it's the moisture that's causing that. You can see also how the overspray is picking up in the wrinkles in the paper. For demonstration, I can live with that, but if you're doing something for professional applications, that would just be unacceptable. have to keep pushing the stencils down to make sure they'll hold as best I can. Make them. It's always better to have lots of thin coats rather than a few thick ones that make it harder on your stencils. Anytime I think I put down a little bit too much paint, I make sure I dry it. You have to be careful with acrylic because it creates such a thin film. It can tear. That's another reason why you don't want to have your paint too thick by the edge of your stencils, because it can actually seal it. That's why I like to use an X-Acto knife to peel it off, just so that I can get it exactly where I need it, without cutting into what I don't. Particularly if you're working dark on a light board, any scratch and you've got a mark. You can see under the H and on the R where the stencils just didn't stick very well. And here I'm showing where the stencils didn't quite match up. Now there's lots of different ways to handle that. The way that I prefer to do it is to just shift my stencil ever so slightly. And I want to put down a lot less paint when I do this. I just want enough to get rid of that white. But if I put down maybe 25% of the paint, it creates a less hard edge, which to me is just a lot more pleasing. Again, this is much more easily obtained with some type of clear film, but still can be done with other types of friscuits. The commercial friscuits are certainly easier than what I would use for most of my other projects, which is just tissue paper. But most of the time, for my typical illustrations, I only need a stencil once. But for purist airbrush, you've really got to focus on the effectiveness of your stencils. It's a lot easier to get it right the first time, to be patient, than it is to go back and try and fix something. Again, I'm just applying very little paint. If I apply too much, then all I've done is mimic the super harsh line that I had before. You can see I'm varying these stencils just a millimeter. It's pretty subtle, but to the trained eye it makes a big difference. Now here I'm offsetting the stencils even more because I want to show some dimension to the letter. I'm trying to keep it simple for this assignment, but I did want to have just a little bit of dimensionality. So I'm spraying with a blue. I like phthalo blue a lot for sky applications, partially because it's so transparent and the colors are just so vivid. I'm imagining that the light will be from the top left, so I'm giving some shading to the bottom right. I'm just not applying much paint at all. In hindsight, I probably didn't need to alternate those stencils for the black, because applying some of this blue would have effectively accomplished the same thing by just darkening that little bit of white where the stencils weren't perfectly matched. But live and learn. It's always good if you can work in a way that does allow you some flexibility to be able to fix mistakes. That's one of the reasons why I like to work opaquely. If you're working transparently, it's a lot harder to fix mistakes. Now I'm going to do just the opposite. I'm going to add a little bit of white coming from the upper left. It does help if you put it the right way. That was a joke. This allows you to see a little bit of the dimensionality to the letters, the edges. Spraying white's really a challenge. The mistakes just show up so readily. And the paint consistency has to be just right. And I'm making some mistakes here that I ordinarily wouldn't have made if I was taking more time, but for the purpose of demonstration, it doesn't have to be exactly perfect, but fortunately I can show you how I will fix that. You'll see really quickly where I made the mistake, which was to not place the center of the O mask. A lot of airbrush artists work a lot larger than what would actually be used, simply because it can be challenging to work with such detail. There are airbrushes that will allow you to work a lot more detailed than others. This is a pretty generalized airbrush approach of what we're doing in class. So again, the most important thing is to make sure your airbrush is clean and get the right consistency. I'll take my airbrush off to the side if I think it's clogging, and you'll see soon what happens when your airbrush clogs and then it all of a sudden comes out all at once. There, I was unscrewing the tip and wiping off any paint that attaches to the needle. Because the highlights got some overspray, this is when I go back in and I just paint with a brush to get that, black like it should. Sometimes I like to use my shield to make sure that I can start the spray there. Obviously there's a point where it did what I described earlier, and there I am taking the tip off to make sure that the paint isn't on the needle. Again, I'll start the spray on the shield there to get it going. Obviously I'm having a hard time getting it going. Either the paint is too thick, or I think that's the problem that I've got going on here. The paint is just too thick. Again, I'd take more time if this were on my own, but for demonstration purpose, I think it's as effective to show the problems when they come up. Sometimes problems don't have to be problems. If you can make a mistake and then cover it up, for example, not all of those highlights are going to be exactly the same. The ones that had some of that spill and overspray, I would make larger than the others. It's hard sometimes to get something that as white as I need, so I'm just going in and kicking the highlights just a little bit. Here I'm going over the highlights just a little bit to be able to get them a little brighter. The thing that's nice about putting a bit of paint down is it gives you a better establishment of what the values are. And putting something thick and white on there tells me I need to add a little bit more with the airbrush. And here's the completed piece. Good luck.